Thus the Austri fleet dropped out of fold space, exactly where the scouts said it would. A quiet transit lane, the kind that only shows up on cargo manifests. 8 unarmed transports, moving slow through the dark between 2 colonies, nobody in the Concorde could have pointed to on a star chart. No escort, no response drones, just hulls full of water. Fleet Marshal Vrian Kess watched them crawl across his targeting grid, one after another, like fruit waiting to drop. The Austri had been sending this particular message for 45 years. Power to the Halvan, to the Corrit assembly, to the pale reef-dwelling Ossun who had made the mistake of settling too close to an Austri expansion lane. The message never changed. You are few. We are legion. Yield or burn. Targeting locks confirmed on all 8. His tactical officer said. Kess lifted one clawed hand. Fire. The transports didn't scatter. That was the first wrong thing. In Kess's experience, cargo ships always scattered. Slow, doomed, but they ran anyway. Because something in every prey animal in the galaxy still believed in the shadow it was running from. These 8 held formation, steady, almost as if they hadn't understood what was happening to them. First salvo caught 3 of them broadside. 2 came apart entirely. The third tore open along its spine and began venting atmosphere in a long white scream of frozen air. The remaining 5 finally broke formation, but not away from the fleet. 2 of them turned toward it. Kess tilted his head at that. Unarmed transports. He checked the grid twice. No weapon signature, no shield harmonics. Just 2 dying ships pointed at his battle group, like something trying to say a word it didn't have the mouth for. Finish them, he said. They did. The message was sent. The Austri fleet folded home, high, and Kess logged the engagement as a standard corridor enforcement action before he went to sleep that night, satisfied in the particular way of a man who believes he has done a small necessary thing well. A doctrine behind that satisfaction was older than Kess himself. High. 3 centuries earlier, the Austri homeworld had come within a single failed harvest cycle of losing 4 billion of its own people to a resource collapse nobody outside the system had cared enough to help prevent. The older houses of that era had simply watched, filed the crisis under internal matter non-priority, and let the Austri claw their own way back from the edge. Every doctrine the Dominion had built since then, every corridor claim, every unbothered bureaucrat reciting procedural language into a relay, traced back to a single inherited conviction: nobody comes to help you. You either hold what is yours by force, or you lose it to someone who will. That was not cruelty, in the Austri telling of it. It was the only lesson their history had ever bothered to teach them twice. He did not know what those 8 ships were carrying. He did not know they belonged to a species that Concorde's older houses had spent a century and 3/4 mostly ignoring. A species the administrative registries still filed, formally, as the Provisional race. Shown up late, shown up loud, forever arguing with itself in 100 different tongues, and somehow, infuriatingly, never collapsing under the weight of its own arguments. A species that cried in public and kept photographs of its dead in its wallets, and had never, not once in 175 years, signed a single standing treaty with anyone strong enough to threaten it. Humanity had petitioned for full concord, standing 9 separate times in that century and 3/4. 9 times the answer had come back dressed in different language: insufficient technological threshold, insufficient political cohesion, insufficient distributed population, insufficient this, insufficient that. And 9 times the goalposts had moved exactly as far as humanity managed to close the distance. Horn. By the fifth rejection, Earth's own historians had stopped pretending the standards were the real obstacle. What the Concorde actually wanted, one retiring ambassador had written in a memoir nobody outside Earth ever read. A hat was for humanity to stay small and grateful and slightly behind, because a species fully in the room was a species with a vote. High, and a vote was a complication none of the older houses particularly wanted to manage. High, he did not know that 3 of those transports carried desalination cores and sealed seed vaults bound for a colony called Calder's Hollow, where 8,400 humans had spent 3 years watching their aquifer network die a little more each season. High, he did not know that the engineer riding the 4th transport, the one that tore open and screamed itself apart before the second salvo finished it, had spent 14 years of her life building the water systems that kept 6 different colonies alive on worlds that didn't deserve to be livable and were because of her. Her name was Dr. Naledi Kumalo. She was 58 years old. She had 4 grandchildren, one of whom she had promised over a crackling relay 2 weeks earlier that she would be home for a birthday in the spring. The ship's final recovered log held 11 seconds of her voice, cut off mid-sentence, reporting a hull integrity fault in the aft seed vault bay and requesting a status check on the crew manifest, a request nobody would ever be able to answer for her. She died in vacuum, with a hand terminal still clipped to her belt, halfway between the crew berth and the cargo hold. Because she had gone to try to secure the seed vault manually when the hull opened around her, like something peeling. Vrain Kess did not know any of this. Nobody in the Austri Dominion knew any of this. The galaxy, as it tends to, found out in pieces. The Concorde's Commerce and Transit Oversight Bureau received the distress beacon logs 36 hours after the attack. Cerulean Records clerk processed them the way clerks process most things, competently, without malice, and without particular attention. She noted the destroyed transponder codes. She noted the species flag. She filed the incident under Austri Corridor Enforcement, a non-member species, and sent an automated notice to the nearest human diplomatic office, because that was the protocol, and protocol in the Concorde was a kind of religion nobody had ever bothered to question. The notice sat in an inbox for 4 hours before anyone opened it. Then a junior attaché named Noor al-Rashid opened it, read it twice, and went very still at her desk. She was 26. She had been posted to Concorde Station for 5 months. In that time she had processed trade disputes, transit permit renewals, and one memorable complaint from a delegation of Vethrine diplomats who found human whistling, of all things, physically painful to their auditory membranes. She had not been trained for this. Nobody trains a 26-year-old. For this she pulled the transponder logs and cross-referenced them against the civilian shipping registry. And then she sat there for 3 full minutes doing absolutely nothing, because her hands didn't seem to want to move yet. Then she picked up the relay and called Earth. It was the deep middle of the night at Meridian Hall, where the Sol Assembly kept its primary offices. Noor got a duty officer first, then a deputy undersecretary, and then, inside 18 minutes, the Secretary Admiral herself. Miriam Castellan was 61 years old, a former fleet commander, and the kind of woman who considered 5 hours of sleep a personal indulgence. She listened to Noor's summary without interrupting once. 37 confirmed, she asked when it was done. 37 confirmed, ma'am. 9 still listed as missing. 2 of the transport logs cut out before final crew counts could transmit. Sea Austri have filed no claim. It looks like it's logged on their end as a routine corridor action. Castellan was quiet for 5 seconds, nor counted every one of them. "Get me the Austri diplomatic channel," Castellan said. "Ma'am, the Austri don't maintain a standing channel with Earth. We've never been formalized with them." "Then get me whoever handles their outgoing communications. Get me the Cerulean liaison desk. Get me the General Concord line. Get me something that eventually reaches whoever gave that fleet its orders." How? Noor got her something. It took another 5 hours. When Castellan finally reached an actual Austria official, a mid-tier administrator named Vex Ortan, who spoke with the profound, unbothered calm of a man discussing shipping delays, he confirmed, Haas, a corridor enforcement action had occurred in the relevant sector. Yes, vessels had been destroyed. They had, as far as his office's records showed, been transiting a lane the Austri Dominion considered under active expansion claim. Was Earth a ratified member of the Concord Treaty framework? No. Had the vessels filed an active humanitarian transit designation with this office prior to entering the corridor? No, because Earth colonies were not eligible to file one. Only ratified Concord members could register a corridor as protected. Then, Ortan explained patiently, the way you might explain something to a child who kept asking why the sky did what it did. Matter would need to proceed through species-tier arbitration, a process that first required the two affected parties to be formally twinned under the Concord's Frontier Registry, a designation neither Earth nor the Dominion had ever bothered to file, because almost nobody had used the registry in over 2 centuries. Twinning applications, once submitted, were queued behind existing filings on a first-in basis. Were, at present count, 61 filings ahead of any new submission. Castellan thanked him. She ended the call. She sat in her office for a long moment, looking at absolutely nothing. Then she called the president. The conversation between Secretary Castellan and President Adaez Bello lasted 35 minutes. Parts of it were later declassified, most of it was not. What the declassified portion showed was a president who asked exactly 4 questions before making a single decision. How many confirmed? Who's still missing? What does Earth actually have within reach of that sector? What does the Concord's own procedure allow us to ask for? Hi. Bello listened to Castellan's answers without interrupting, a trait several of her staff had noted she shared, oddly, with the Secretary Admiral herself, and then convened the Seoul Security Council at 2:30 in the morning, still in the clothes she'd been wearing when the call woke her. "I want to be careful about one word in this room," she told the assembled council before any formal business began. "By defensive. Everything we do in the next 72 hours is defensive. Not preparatory, not deterrent, not a message of our own to anyone. If a single asset moves in a way that reads as offensive positioning, I will hear about it personally, and I will not be pleased. We do not become the thing we are asking the Concorde to hold someone else accountable for." Several members of the council exchanged glances. It was more than one of them thought privately, an unusually specific thing to insist on at 2:30 in the morning, 6 hours, after learning 37 of their citizens were dead. It was also, they would each come to believe over the following weeks, exactly the discipline that made everything afterward possible. By 0500, every human military asset within 3 transit jumps of the attack site had been placed on defensive alert. Defensive, a distinction the president insisted on twice more before the session closed. By 800, Earth's diplomatic mission at Concord Station had formally requested an emergency session of the full Meridian Concord on the grounds of an unprovoked attack against unarmed civilian relief vessels. The Concord's administrative office replied that the next available emergency session slot was in 9 weeks. Earth's ambassador, a career diplomat named Teodora Marchetti, 17 years into a posting that had aged her more than the number suggested, received that reply, read it twice, and sent a second message. Hi. This one marked urgent species security matter, addressed directly to the Concord's presiding chair. Presiding chair was here a Sorellan elder named Ur Tethalis, 24 years into a chairmanship that had, in that time, received perhaps a dozen requests marked with that particular flag. All of them, without exception, had come from older houses, species with standing fleets, centuries of Concord membership, the accumulated weight of being taken seriously by default. He opened Marchetti's message mostly out of habit. It was 3 sentences long. The Austri Dominion has destroyed 8 Earth civilian relief vessels carrying humanitarian cargo. 37 citizens are confirmed dead. Earth formally requests an emergency session within 60 hours, or will consider this matter permanently unaddressed by this Concord. Hallis read it a second time, then a third. Word of the request moved through Concord Station faster than any official channel could have carried it, the way word always does in a place that small. Parit, smaller delegations. The Korit, the reef-dwelling Ossoon, a handful of houses that had spent decades being told their own grievances, would be reviewed within the standard window and had learned, painfully, what that phrase actually meant in practice, found themselves following the story with an attention that surprised even them. None of them said so publicly, openly rooting for the provisional race against an established Concord doctrine was not a position any of them could afford to be seen holding, not with their own standing as precarious as it was. But in private channels, in quarters not meant for older house ears, a quiet question kept circulating. If this works, does it work for us too? It was not solidarity, exactly. And nobody was naive enough to call it that. It was closer to the specific, cautious hope of people who have watched the same door stay shut for a very long time, suddenly noticing that someone else is leaning their whole weight against it. He did not answer it immediately. He called an old colleague first, a retired Sorellan trade envoy who had spent 6 years, decades ago, embedded with a human negotiating team during an early resource-sharing dispute. Tellis asked him a single question: what happens if you refuse them? The old envoy was quiet for a moment. They don't go home, he said. That's the thing nobody in this chamber has understood about them yet. Every other species we've made wait eventually stops waiting and adjusts. Humans don't adjust. They just keep showing up at the door with the same request, year after year, until either you let them in or you run out of centuries. Tellis granted the session. 60 hours became 41, once the scheduling committee finished arguing about venue. What Earth did with those 41 hours was not what the Concord expected. There was no fleet build-up announcement, no show of force parked ominously at the border of Austri space. Castellan quietly repositioned defensive pickets around 3 vulnerable colonies, Calder's Hollow among them, and made certain everyone understood the word defensive was doing real work in that sentence. She was not interested, she told her staff, in giving the Austria second incident to file under enforcement protocol. Instead, something else happened, and it happened almost entirely out of public view. Admiral Theo Lindqvist, who had commanded the escort wing that should have been assigned to that convoy and hadn't been. Because Earth's shipping lanes were still, after a century and 3/4, treated by the Concorde as informal and therefore unprotected. Lindqvist sat down at his desk on the second night and began writing letters. 37 of them, one for each confirmed dead, by hand, not dictated, not templated. He did not release them to the press. Someone on his staff did that without asking him. 3 days later, and by then it didn't matter, because the letters were already what they were. Not policy, not strategy, just a 61-year-old man admitting in his own handwriting that he had failed to protect people whose names he was now learning for the first time by writing them down. Ambassador Marchetti built something different. Not a legal brief, though her staff produced one of those too. Dense and precise, and ultimately she suspected beside the point. She placed a call instead, not to Earth's military command, but to a civilian registry office that most of the Sol Assembly had forgotten still existed. While the independent carriers relay, an unofficial decades-old habit among human salvage crews and merchant haulers operating near contested frontier space, of sharing sensor logs with each other over unsecured channels, apart mostly to warn one another about pirates and bad weather systems, never meant to be anything more organized than that. Permanent, it turned out to be more organized than anyone had given it credit for. Hide. Within 6 hours of Marchetti's request, a retired salvage captain named Iris Fon, who ran the relay's informal archive out of a converted cargo hold above a fueling depot 2 jumps from Concorde Station, sent back 4 months of compiled Austri patrol movement data logged by ordinary human traders who had simply been in the wrong lane at the right time and, out of habit, written it down. The data showed something Vex Ortan's office had not mentioned. 3 months before the attack, the corridor Calder's Hollows convoy had used was flagged. In a completely separate Concorde subsystem, the Austri Dominion also had standing access to, as an active relief and famine response transit lane, a designation filed not by Earth, but by a Concorde humanitarian office responding to Calder's Hollow's own drought registration. The flag had never been revoked. The Austri fleet had folded into a lane their own systems should have shown as carrying emergency civilian cargo, and fired anyway. Marchetti did not plan to lead with grief. That wasn't the point, and she knew, from 17 years of watching this chamber operate, that raw emotion performed for effect, read to the older houses as exactly the kind of instability they already expected from humans. And would cost more credibility than it bought. What she wanted instead was simpler and stranger. She wanted the Concorde to see that a scattered, informal, entirely unofficial network of ordinary human traders had assembled better situational awareness of that corridor in 6 hours than the Dominion's own enforcement doctrine had bothered to check before opening fire. Not evidence of malice, evidence of carelessness dressed up as procedure, which in this chamber, she suspected, would land harder than malice ever could. This was, she understood, the thing the Concorde had never quite priced into its calculations. Hermant, not human weapons, those existed, and Castellan's fleet strength was no longer the joke it had been 50 years earlier. But nobody credible believed Earth could challenge the older houses militarily. Not yet, not for decades. What the Concorde had never priced in was a species that had, almost by accident, built a distributed civilian information network wide enough to catch what a professional enforcement fleet had missed, and a diplomatic corps patient enough to let that network do the talking instead of a battle line. Other species, when wronged and dismissed, filed the loss away and moved on, because moving on was efficient, and efficiency was survival. Humans. For reasons the anthropological desks at Concord Station had been writing baffled reports about for a century, kept records nobody asked them to keep, out of habit, out of stubbornness, and then, infuriatingly, produced them at exactly the moment it mattered most. Castellan and Marchetti spoke twice a day during those 41 hours. On a relay channel neither of their staffs were permitted to log. But it was, on the surface, an odd pairing, the admiral who wanted contingencies for every outcome, and the diplomat who kept insisting that over-preparing for confrontation would lead to this specific chamber, hide as exactly the aggression the older houses expected and were braced to punish. They argued about it more than once. "If this goes wrong," Castellan said on the second call, "I need to know what wrong looks like before it happens, not after. Wrong looks like us sitting at that little table by the wall for another 175 years. Marchetti said, "That's the only version of wrong I'm planning for. Keep your ships where they are. Defensive posture, nothing forward, nothing that gives Ortan a photograph to wave around. Let me do the part that isn't yours to do." Castellan didn't love it, she said so, but she also, in 30 years of service, had learned to recognize when someone else read on a room was better than hers. And she trusted Marchetti's read on this particular room more than she trusted her own instinct to put ships where the cameras could see them. That restraint was tested 20 hours into the wait, on the defensive picket holding position above Calder's Hollow itself. A sensor operator flagged an unidentified contact folding into the system's outer edge, mass and drive signature consistent with an Austri light cruiser. The picket's commanding officer, a 34-year-old captain named Rosa Delgado, who had buried a cousin among the 37, had 6 seconds to decide whether the ship in front of her was a scout gathering intelligence for a second strike, and every instinct she owned was screaming at her to treat it like one. She held fire. She hailed instead, twice, on an open channel and got back, after 9 of the longest seconds of her career, a startled, entirely civilian trade transponder belonging to a Corrit merchant vessel that had wandered off its filed course and had no idea it had just drifted directly into the most heavily watched piece of space in the sector. Delgado stood the picket down, logged the incident in full, and did not sleep for the rest of her shift, replaying the 6 seconds in which she had almost turned a lost cargo hauler into the second incident of the week. She called it in to Castellan, personally, unprompted, because she wanted the Secretary Admiral to know exactly how close the line had come to being crossed on Earth's side this time, by Earth's own hand, out of nothing but grief and a bad sensor read. Castellan listened to the whole report without interrupting, the way she had listened to Noor 5 days earlier. "You held," Castellan said, when Delgado finished. "I almost didn't, ma'am. Almost isn't the same thing as didn't. You held. That's what goes in the record, and that's what time telling Ambassador Marchetti happened up there today." She paused. "The whole point of the last 175 years is that we don't get to be the thing that gets called routine. Not once, not even when it would have been understandable. Word of the independent carrier's relay data reached most of the delegations before the session convened, the way word reaches everyone in a station that small. Some delegates found it beside the point, a technicality, a distraction from the actual question of doctrine and sovereignty. Others, mostly from smaller houses who had spent decades being told their own frontier incidents were simply the cost of living near a larger power, found themselves oddly unable to stop thinking about it. Vexortan, briefed on the development by an aide, dismissed it in 4 words. They'll bring paperwork. He was not wrong. He had simply misunderstood what the paperwork was for. Fleet Marshal Kess, 4 Transit jumps away in Austria home space, heard about the emergency session through a routine intelligence digest and felt, for a reason he could not immediately name, a small and unfamiliar discomfort settled somewhere behind his sternum. He had logged the convoy as routine. He still believed technically that the engagement had been procedurally correct. But procedurally correct and routine had started, in the last 2 days, to feel like 2 different words wearing the same uniform, and he did not enjoy noticing the difference. The chamber where the Meridian Concord convened its full sessions was carved from a single asteroid, hollowed out over 4 centuries by 3 different Cerulean dynasties who had each wanted their own ceiling. Delegates sat in rings, oldest houses closest to the center. Newer arrivals pushed toward walls of pale stone that had been polished until they held a faint reflection of everything in the room. Earth's seating for 175 years had been a single small table near the outer wall. Unassigned, provisional, like everything else about their standing. The Noor al-Rashid sat in the staff gallery behind the delegation table, 26 years old, and 5 months into a posting she had assumed, 5 days earlier, would consist mostly of transit permits for the rest of her career. She had not been asked to attend. She had asked to attend, and Castellan, who had by then learned Noor's name and would not soon forget it, had signed off without hesitation. Noor had been the one who opened the notice. She had decided, somewhere in the sleepless stretch of the last week, that she owed it to the 37 and to herself to be in the room when it mattered. Marchetti did not sit there this time. Nobody had reassigned her seat. There had been no time, no precedent, no vote, but she walked past the small outer table without slowing and took a chair at the edge of the speaking floor itself, close enough that the chamber's ambient light caught her face directly. Nobody stopped her. That in itself told her something. Vexortan spoke first on behalf of the Dominion. He was composed. He was, Marchetti thought, almost admirably composed, in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed the difference between an apology and an explanation, and chosen the explanation on purpose. He described the corridor's contested status. He described 45 years of consistent Austrian doctrine regarding unclaimed lanes near active expansion zones. He used the words proportionate and procedurally sound 4 times each. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The chamber had heard versions of this speech before, from other species, in other centuries, and it had a rhythm. The older houses recognized the way you recognize a familiar piece of music, not because you like it, but because you've stopped being surprised by it. He sat down, having said, in essence, "We've followed our own rules, and our rules did not include you." Marchetti stood. She had brought notes, 6 pages, dense with the careful diplomatic register 17 years in this chamber had trained into her hands. The whereases, citation numbers, the precise legal architecture her staff had built to make Earth's case unimpeachable on paper. She left them on the table. 37, she said. The chamber, which had not been fully quiet for Ortan, went quiet for her. 9 still missing. One of the confirmed dead was 58 years old. She had spent 14 years of her life building the water systems that keep 6 colonies breathing on worlds that would otherwise have killed everyone on them. She had 4 grandchildren who will grow up being told what this chamber decided today. She did not raise her voice either. She had learned 17 years ago that volume read to this chamber as instability, and instability was the one card she could not afford to play. "I'm not going to spend my time arguing the corridor's legal status," she said. "Heart, my staff has done that in the documents in front of you, and you can read them at your convenience, within whatever window your procedures allow. I want to talk about something else first. 4 months before the attack, this corridor was flagged in your own systems as an active humanitarian transit lane. In response to a drought registration, this Concord itself processed. The Austrian Dominion had standing access to that flag. It was never checked. A handful of independent human traders. Nobody official, nobody with a mandate. People who log sensor data out of habit, because habit has kept them alive longer than procedure ever did, found that flag in 6 hours. I want to talk about what this Concord has decided. For 175 years, my species is for. She let that sit for exactly as long as she'd planned to. You have called us provisional, emotional, fractured, loud. You have not been wrong about any of that, and I am not here to dispute it. We are loud, we are fractured. Ask any of us, we'll list our own failures faster than you can. But you drew a conclusion from that noise, and the conclusion was that it made us manageable. Predictable, a species young enough and disorganized enough that its grief would burn itself out on your schedule. The way every grief in this chamber apparently has eventually, quietly out of respect for how business gets done here. That was the error, she said, not the observation, the conclusion. She looked, for the first time since standing, directly at the Austrian delegation. We do not file our dead away. We do not consider a filed grievance the same thing as a resolved one. Long after this Concord's registry queue works its way down to filing number 61, traders who found that flag in 6 hours will still be flying that corridor, still keeping the same records out of the same habit. And so will their children and their children's children, for as long as this species exists to remember anything at all. That is not a threat. It's a description of what we are, and I would ask this body, respectfully, to finally take the description seriously, instead of filing it under emotional one more time. She sat down. The chamber did not applaud. The older houses did not, as a rule, applaud anything, but something in the ambient noise changed register. A shift Marchetti had felt exactly twice before in 17 years, and never at this volume. Vexortan sat very still through all of it. He had prepared for legal argument. He had prepared for anger. Even anger was familiar, manageable, something a good procedural counter-argument could usually absorb and deflect. He had not prepared for a woman standing 6 meters away from him describing, in a level and unhurried voice, exactly how a network of nobody in particular had done in 6 hours what his own enforcement doctrine had failed to do in months. Check a flag that was sitting in plain sight the entire time. It was not an accusation of malice. It was somehow worse than that. He kept his expression exactly where his training had put it. Carting. Underneath it, something he did not have a comfortable name for had started quietly to reorganize itself. The debate that followed was not clean. A Halven delegate, representing one of the older houses with a long memory of its own losses on the Concord's periphery, rose to argue that the precedent set by expedited standing for one young species could destabilize the entire membership queue. That procedure existed precisely to prevent exactly this kind of emotionally driven exception. He was not shouted down. Several delegations murmured agreement. It was, Marchetti had to admit privately, not an unreasonable argument on its own terms. It was simply an argument that had never once high in 175 years, been tested against an actual room full of the people it affected. A Corrit delegate, small house, 3 votes, historically silent on anything involving newer species, asked to be recognized. It took the chamber a moment to remember the Corrit had that right at all. She stood, said that her own homeworld had waited 11 decades for a Concord response to a border dispute that had cost them a moon. Hard, and that she had grown up believing quiet patience was simply what small species owed the Concord in exchange for continued existence. "I am tired," she said, "of teaching my children that lesson." She sat back down. It was, by Concord standards, an extraordinary thing to say out loud in that chamber. Permanence noted it the way he noted very little else that day. What followed was 3 hours of procedure that the public record would later compress into a single paragraph. Because that is what public records do to the parts that matter most. There were 3 motions. The first established a binding cessation of Austrian enforcement action against non-member relief and humanitarian transit, backed by mandatory Concord notification protocols, the kind of structural change that closes the exact loophole Vex Orton had used with such calm. Passed with a wide majority. The second motion authorized formal reparations to the families of the confirmed dead and missing, funded jointly by the Dominion, and a Concord emergency fund that had, as far as anyone present could recall, never actually been used. It passed narrowly, with several older houses abstaining, which in Concord procedure counted as a kind of yes that required nothing of you personally, a way of agreeing without ever quite standing up for it. Marchetti noted, without surprise, which delegations chose that option. Third motion granted Earth an expedite pathway to full Concord standing, with a formal review in 18 standard months rather than the usual multi-decade waiting period newer species were customarily made to endure. Before the vote was called, Chairman Tethelis rose from the presiding platform, which he almost never did outside of procedural necessity. "This body prides itself on procedure," he said. "I have spent 24 years believing procedure was the same thing as fairness. Because procedure is what keeps a chamber this old from tearing itself apart over every new grievance that walks through the door. Today I learned procedure can also be the thing that lets a flag sit unchecked for 4 months because checking it was nobody's specific job. That is not a failure of this young species' patience. It is a failure of our own bookkeeping, dressed up for a very long time as wisdom." He paused. "I would rather say that plainly once than continue pretending the distinction doesn't matter." A third motion passed, not by a landslide. Old houses did not do landslides as a species-wide habit, but it passed, Tethelis noted quietly, which delegations had voted yes for what appeared to be the first time in living memory on anything involving a species this young. The session had been broadcast live across every human world and colony, an arrangement Marchetti's office had insisted on months before anyone imagined it would matter this much. On Earth, it was the middle of the afternoon in most time zones, and public squares in a dozen cities filled anyway. People standing shoulder to shoulder in front of oversized screens they hadn't planned to watch together, but somehow ended up watching together regardless. When the third vote result registered, there was no single unified reaction. Some cities cheered, some went quiet. One crowd in a plaza near Meridian Hall simply stood in silence for almost a full minute. The way you go quiet after holding your breath longer than you meant to. In a rented room above the fueling depot 2 jumps from Concord Station, Iris Fon watched the vote alongside 3 other retired haulers who had spent the last 2 days helping her staff pull records for Marchetti's team. None of them said much when the third motion passed. One of them, a woman who had flown that corridor for over 20 years, poured 4 glasses of something homemade and didn't offer a toast, because she didn't trust her voice yet. They drank anyway. Solène Ashi, a Cerelan network journalist who had covered this chamber for 11 years and had never once seen it produce anything worth more than a procedural footnote, watched from the press gallery and began composing the piece in her head before the session had even formally closed. Aside the Dominion, the 3 days between the vote and the signing were not quiet. Vex Ortan carried the terms back to the Dominion's ruling council personally, along with his own recommendation, accept quickly, before the Concord's expedited standing motion gave the humans enough diplomatic momentum to push for terms even less favorable to Austri doctrine. He was not the only voice in that room. A senior War Council member named Draeth Solun argued, forcefully, that accepting cessation terms, after a single procedurally sound engagement, would read across every contested corridor the Dominion held as an admission of weakness. And that weakness, once shown to a species this persistent, would not stay contained to one sector. Orton did not disagree with the risk. He simply weighed it against a different one. "We can hold the line on doctrine," he told the council, "and in a year we will be fighting a war on that corridor we did not choose the timing of, against a species that has just demonstrated it does not stop asking until someone answers. Or we can accept a treaty now on terms we helped write, while we still have the leverage of choosing when to say yes." He paused. "I watched the ambassador stand in that chamber and refuse to raise her voice one single time. That is not the behavior of a species planning to go away quietly if we wait them out. I would rather negotiate with that now than fight it later." The council voted, narrowly to accept. Solun's objection was formally recorded and formally overruled. A small procedural fact that would matter more. In years, neither man could yet see clearly than either of them understood in that room. The treaty was signed 4 days later in a smaller chamber in front of far fewer witnesses. Marchetti signed for Earth, Thelis signed as presiding witness, Vex Ortan signed for the Dominion. His expression unreadable. Whatever calculation he'd made about the whole affair, kept entirely to himself. The 37 letters Admiral Lindquist had written went out by ordinary mail relay over the following month, one at a time, no ceremony attached to any of them. He asked that none be photographed on delivery. Most families honored that, one did not. And a single image, an elderly man on Calder's Hollow holding a handwritten page at his own kitchen table, his expression unreadable, circulated quietly for a few days before it too faded from public attention the way most things eventually did. Lindquist never commented on it publicly. When a staffer asked him, once, why he'd bothered writing them all by hand instead of having his office draft something faster, he said only that speed hadn't been the point. There was a woman in the observer section, a colonist from Calder's Hollow, whose husband had been among the missing and was, by then, presumed among the dead, one of a handful who had traveled out for the signing on their own, at their own expense, because they wanted to be there, who cried without any sound at all while the treaty was sealed, her hand pressed flat against her own mouth, as if she could keep the sound in by force. Achibi saw her. She did not photograph her. Some things Achibi had decided years ago. High were not hers to take, even in service of a story that mattered this much. Ahad, Chairman Tellis remained in the empty chamber for a long while after the session closed, alone, except for the maintenance drones that would begin resetting the seating configuration for the next agenda item within the hour. 24 years in the presiding chair, and he could count on one hand the number of times he had stayed behind like this. High. He found himself looking at the small outer table, Earth's old assigned seat, still technically theirs until the standing review formalized something else, and thinking about the old envoy's answer to his question. They just keep showing up at the door. He had spent 24 years managing a chamber built to make patience look like wisdom and delay look like fairness. And he had believed, mostly, that he was good at his job because the chamber ran smoothly, because grievances got filed and reviewed and closed within their windows, because nothing broke. It had not occurred to him until a species barely old enough to have finished arguing about its own borders stood up and refused to let a filing be the end of anything. That smooth and fair had never actually been the same thing, and that he had spent a very long career mistaking one for the other. He did not know yet what he would do with that realization. He suspected it would take longer than the 18 months of Earth's pending review to figure out. But he sat with it anyway, in the empty chamber, in a silence that felt different from every other silence he had sat in there before. Fleet Marshal Kess watched the signing footage alone, 4 transit jumps away, 3 days after it aired. He had put off watching it. He told himself the delay was operational, a routine backlog, other priorities, and he was fairly sure by the second day that this was not true. What struck him was not the treaty language, which his own analysts had already summarized for him in 4 flat paragraphs. It was the detail about the flag, a routine humanitarian designation, sitting in a shared system his own fleet had access to, unchecked, because checking it had never been anyone's specific job. Kess sat with that fact longer than he expected to. He had killed 37 people he had never thought of as people until a diplomat 6 days later stood in a chamber and made the entire Concord watch a handful of ordinary traders find. In 6 hours, the exact information his own command had never bothered to look for in months. He did not feel forgiven by the treaty. He had not asked to be. He felt, instead, the specific and unfamiliar discomfort of a man who has spent 45 years being told a story about small, manageable species, and has just watched that story fail to hold weight in front of him for the first time. He did not report the feeling to anyone. He was not certain yet what to do with it. But he did not sleep well that night, and it was the first night in a long career that a routine corridor engagement had cost him any sleep at all. He was not alone in that. Within the Dominion's own command structure, the treaty landed as something closer to an earthquake than the older houses ever gave it credit for outside their borders. Vex Auton found himself, in the weeks that followed, quietly and repeatedly summoned to explain how a procedurally sound engagement had produced a binding cessation clause, a reparations fund, and a species that had, within a single Concord session, moved further towards standing than the Dominion's own historical rivals had managed in a century. He gave the same answer every time because it was the only honest one available to him. They simply refused to stop asking. It was not a satisfying answer to give a chain of command built on the doctrine that force settled every question worth settling. 3 officers under Kess's command quietly requested reassignment to Texas farther from human space in the months that followed. Marquez did not request the same. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he wanted to see what the humans did next. Thank that none of this made it into any public record. It rarely does, but it existed, in the same way a hairline crack exists in a wall, long before anyone notices the plaster has started to separate. Not visible yet, not urgent yet, but real, and spreading in its own slow and unglamorous way. Solène Aché published her piece 6 days after the signing. She had been composing it, in fragments, since the moment she watched Marchetti walk past the small outer table without sitting down. Her editors wanted a tight summary piece for the general feed. She delivered a long-form investigation instead, and fought to keep it that way, because she decided the story didn't work as a summary. The whole point was the specific, boring, overlooked detail of an unchecked flag, and summaries are where specific details go to die. But it ran in full. Within a week, translation requests came in from 9 different Concord networks she'd never had a single reader from before. A headline, which she wrote herself and which nobody touched, read, "What the Provisional Race Told Us," whether we were listening or not. She wrote about the convoy, about Dr. Kumalo, about the 14 years and the 4 grandchildren and the 11 seconds of recovered voice log that nobody would ever get to finish hearing. She wrote about Admiral Lindqvist's 37 letters, mailed quietly with no ceremony attached. She wrote about Iris Fon and the fueling depot, and the 6 hours it took a handful of retired haulers to find what an entire enforcement fleet had missed. She wrote about the Corrit delegate who stood up, for the first time in living memory, to say she was tired of teaching her children patience. The piece ended with a passage she rewrote 9 times before it sat right on the page. For 175 years, this Concord has called humanity provisional. Young, emotional, too fractured for real power, too loud for serious diplomacy. We have not been wrong about any of that, and I do not think humans themselves would dispute it. What we have been wrong about is the conclusion we drew from it. We looked at the noise and the grief, and the songs they write for their dead, and we read all of it as weakness, as something that would make them predictable, manageable, easy to file away on our own schedule. We did not stop to consider what happens to a species that refuses to let its grief expire. We did not consider what it means to carry a photograph of your grandmother into a chamber built before your species learned to farm, and to still be carrying it, unweathered, a century from now. The Concord expected a grievance filing. Humanity sent an ambassador who would not read from her notes, and a stack of censor logs kept by nobody official, out of nothing but habit. I do not think the Austri fully understand yet what that combination means. I am not sure this chamber does either, but I watched a woman cry without a sound while a treaty was sealed with her missing husband's name attached to it. And I thought, something was learned here this year. I hope we are wise enough to remember what it was, long after the review window closes and the news moves on to something else. On Calder's Hollow, life continued in the specific, unglamorous way that life continues after the news cameras leave. The desalination cores that survived the attack. 3 of the original 8 transports had made it through. Escorted the rest of the way by ships nobody had officially ordered forward. Came online 11 weeks late. Which was 11 weeks longer than the aquifer network could comfortably afford, but not so late that it couldn't be recovered from. Dr. Priya Reyes ran the colony's only clinic 7 days a week, which was what she had always done. And what she intended to keep doing, regardless of what any treaty said. She had read the coverage. She had watched the signing broadcast on a cracked wall screen in her clinic's waiting room, between patients, with the sound turned low. She had noted all of it, filed it somewhere quiet, and gone back to work, because that was also what she had always done. Permanent. A young journalist came out to Calder's Hollow the week after Achebe's piece ran, fresh out of school, a little overwhelmed by how far the colony actually was from anything. She wanted to talk about Dr. Kumalo, about the convoy, about what Reyes made of the outcome. Rise gave her 20 minutes between patients. She talked about Naledi. She'd known her, briefly, during one of the site visits 8 years earlier, before either of them had grandchildren old enough to matter to the conversation. She talked about the children in her clinic who were alive because the cause had eventually arrived, even 11 weeks late. One of them, a boy named Thomas, had been 6 months old and severely dehydrated the week the desalination line finally came back online. He was 2 years old now, loud and stubborn and entirely unaware that his existence had ever been in question, which Reyes considered the correct way for a 2-year-old to feel about anything. She kept his intake chart from that week in a drawer she didn't open often, not because she needed reminding, but because some days she needed the option of being reminded, and having it there felt like enough. She talked too about the ones who hadn't made it in those 11 weeks, because she thought that belonged in the story as much as anything else did. And she wasn't going to let anyone edit that part out for the sake of a cleaner ending. Cadole. The journalist asked if she thought the treaty was enough. Rise laughed, once without much humor in it. Enough for what? Enough to bring anyone back? No, enough to matter. Ask me again in 5 years, when we see whether anyone actually checks a flag before they fire next time. She checked the time on her wrist unit. A patient was already 15 minutes late, for a slot she couldn't afford to lose. A treaty doesn't run a desalination line. People do. I'll believe it mattered when the work gets easier, not before. What else would you want? The same thing I want every day. For the work to be easier than it is, for the people who need help to not have to wait so long to get it, for the next convoy to arrive on time. She looked at the journalist directly. What happened to Naledi happened because somebody decided that what she was carrying didn't matter enough to protect. A treaty says it mattered. That's not nothing. But the best outcome isn't that we got a good treaty out of this. The best outcome is that the next time there's an engineer on a transport heading somewhere hard, and nobody even considers stopping her. Do you think that's possible? Reyes stood. She had a patient waiting. She always had a patient waiting. I think more is possible now than was possible a year ago, she said. So I'm going to keep working until the rest of it becomes possible too. Permanent. She went back to her clinic. Outside, Calder's Hollow was ordinary, rust-colored soil, a low, hardy scrub that had survived 3 years of drought out of pure stubbornness, a sky that looked almost, but not quite like home. 8,400 people making something livable out of the space they'd been given. Someone had welded a small plaque to the clinic's outer wall the week after the signing, 37 names, stamped by hand, no ceremony, no unveiling. Rise walked past it every morning. She had stopped needing to read it to know what it said. Above the colony, quiet and mostly invisible, a small defensive picket held its position. It would hold it for a while longer. Some of what the galaxy had learned in the months since the convoy burned would stick. Some of it would fade, the way old habits fade slowly even after everyone agrees they should. Framework that had run the Concorde for centuries was not going to remake itself overnight because one young species had finally refused to let a filing marked "Resolved" be the last word on the matter. Noor al-Rashid stayed on at Concorde Station another full year after the signing, longer than her original posting required. Highs. When people asked her why, she gave the honest answer only once to Castellan, on a routine call that had nothing to do with the question. Han. I opened that report, she said. I keep thinking somebody should stay and make sure it doesn't just become a report again, a thing that gets filed and forgotten because the next crisis is always right behind the last one. Castellan didn't argue with her. She simply extended the posting without being asked twice. But something had shifted, and it was hard to name precisely what. Kess felt it 4 transit jumps away, without fully understanding it yet. Small houses felt it, the ones who had spent decades voting quietly and abstaining loudly. Pathalis felt it in the chamber, in the moment the third motion passed, and delegations who had never once voted yes on anything involving a species this young did so anyway. High. The Corrit delegate, who had stood up to say she was tired of teaching her children. Patience filed her own overdue border grievance again the following month, for the first time in 11 decades, citing the Calder precedent by name in the opening paragraph. It did not resolve quickly. It did not resolve at all, not that year. But it moved further through the Concorde's machinery in 4 months than it had in the previous 11 decades combined. Odd, and that, for a species that had learned to expect nothing, was its own kind of answer to the question they had all been asking quietly, in channels not meant for older house ears. If this works, does it work for us too? Not yet entirely, but maybe, and maybe it turned out, was a word smaller species had not been allowed to use out loud in that chamber in a very long time. It was not a revolution. It was not a sudden redistribution of power in the galaxy. It was something smaller than that, and possibly more durable. The plain knowledge that the framework had a limit, that there was a point past which the committee schedules and the registry queues and the filings marked "resolved" could produce an outcome that some species would simply, calmly, permanently decline to accept, and that those species would not be unreasonable for declining. Outwelling. They would have done the accounting, they would have carried the photographs and written the letters and chosen, deliberately, not to call it resolved, because some things aren't resolved. They are only ever reckoned with. The convoy burned, 37 people died. An engineer ran out of time 11 seconds before anyone could hear the rest of what she was trying to say. And Earth looked at what had been done and at what the galaxy expected in return, and chose something other than the easy option and something other than the convenient one. And not conquest, not silence, the honest thing, which turned out in the end to be the one thing nobody in that chamber had actually been braced for. Not resolved, reckoned with, remembered, video outro, narrator's voice neutral, spoken, after the story has fully closed. That's the story of the Calder convoy, and the moment a Concorde that had spent a century and 3/4 calling humanity provisional finally had to sit with what that dismissal actually cost. If you were in that chamber, would you have done what Marchetti did? Walked in with a stack of ordinary sensor logs instead of a show of force? Or would you have played it safer? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. If stories like this are the kind of thing that hits you somewhere real, hit subscribe now. Because the next one picks up exactly where the 18-month Concorde review leaves off. And the Austri Dominion is not the only house that's about to find out what a species that refuses to file its grief away actually looks like when it's finally sitting at the main table instead of the small one by the wall.